Hello, and welcome to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. My name is Derek MacCuish. My guest today in the Pathways to Peace series of interviews is Stephen Rapp, who is widely respected for his decades of work for justice and accountability in areas of conflict and war crimes. In 2001, he joined the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda as part of the effort to prosecute those responsible for the genocide of 1994, and he headed the trial team that achieved the first convictions in history for those in the media who incited genocide. He directed the prosecution of former Liberian President Charles Taylor and others responsible for crimes during more than 10 years of extreme violence in the Sierra Leone Civil War. As U.S. Ambassador at Large for war crimes issues, his office achieved the first convictions in history for sexual slavery and forced marriage as crimes against humanity, and for attacks on peacekeepers and the use of child soldiers as violations of international humanitarian law. He has been engaged in efforts for justice and accountability in dozens of countries, most recently in Syria, where, he said, the worst atrocities of the 21st century were committed. I started our discussion by asking him about how a condition of peace might be achieved in a place where people have suffered from extreme violence. I thought that we could talk a bit about how a nation or a community can move to a condition of peace, peace being the theme of this series, especially following extreme violence, which is generally your area, how there can be systems of justice and accountability and prevention of atrocity and genocide. And what does that require in a community or in a nation to move to a condition of peaceful coexistence after such difficulty? But I thought I'd also ask you if there were particular things that you wanted to talk about.
I'll talk about my own experience in different situations, which of course included prosecuting at Rwanda Tribunal and at the Sierra Leone Special Court, and what I thought the results of that, and then of course all of the situations that I've engaged in as ambassador at large, probably 25 at least post-conflict situations or ongoing conflict situations where I was involved in justice and sometimes involved in the resolution of conflict, as like in Colombia, for instance, trying to develop transitional justice methods that wouldn't violate international law, for instance. Obviously, you will quite often have the perpetrators who say, give us the South African model. We like that. We don't have to go to jail. We'll confess that 1/10 of what we did, all will be forgiven. And technically, under international law, that's not permitted anymore. An amnesty that gives you a complete walk for serious violations of human rights is not effective. We had one in Sierra Leone, and we basically said it didn't apply. And in Argentina, they passed a full stop law after the trial of the junta, the three juntas, but then the Supreme Court struck it down 15 years later and said, no, you can prosecute those kinds of crimes. So, you have those issues, that to some extent limit the flexibility, even though, of course, in the peace process, there'll be dictators say, well, of course, I'm not going to agree to go to jail, for heaven's sakes. Get out of here. I got to have a deal. I'm going to keep killing people. So how do you deal with these things from a practical standpoint? This is challenging. But what happens to society if you don't deal with it, you just get more crimes. People do it again. So anyway, that's what you want to talk about. I'm glad you talked about it.
One of the things that I'm curious about, and this also relates back to the violence that you became so closely connected to in terms of the accountability and restoration of the country, where in Rwanda and Sierra Leone, the people that were part of the violence, as in Syria, we have in Syria, the big trenches that were dug for the bodies, the walls that were put up to surround the mass grave sites, the people who, were in the military. I mean, it reminds me of Hannah Arendt's discussion of the banality of evil, that much evil is done by ordinary people who may not be acting out of a ideology or a hatred, but they're sort of going about it as a business, and I can't get my head around that. And I'm not sure what it means in terms of restoration of normality in places like Rwanda and Sierra Leone, and what might hopefully what one might hopefully look forward to in Syria. And I don't know if it's something you really you can comment on.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad to talk about it. It's, it is like that. I mean, I tend to, this is why I'm, more selective prosecution sort of individual, even though you may get different views from victims. Many people, and like the Nobel Prize winner, Sonia Vayachuk, said, we need to prosecute all the Russian war criminals, not pick and choose. And, but, most of us who are involved in this think that there are authors of these crimes and people that really benefited from them and who decided to target people on ethnic or religious basis for their political ends, and those are the people that should truly be prosecuted, and those that are more conscripted in the process should be dealt with in other ways, arguably. Other ways to rehabilitate themselves, et cetera, to own up to their crimes and ask for forgiveness, et cetera, and go about their lives. And we obviously know in the context of Syria, we don't want the devaluation, for instance, that they had in Iraq, where the state becomes, and they've done it to a point in Syria, but not quite to the extent of Iraq, where there's nobody there, to maintain law and order, so to speak, and nobody monitor the traffic, et cetera, to go after ordinary criminals, et cetera. The state ceases to exist, and then a variety of groups rise up, and we're in conflict, and there's nobody to really control it. So these are balancing always that need to be done, and in the most transparent way possible, in which there's the kind of maximum buy-in of the society in terms of how they want to resolve it. And every situation has been different, and in most situations there's no failure, and recurrence of conflict, impunity breeding impunity. And how to do this right is something that people will debate. Failure to confront it is not one of the ways to solve it. You have to confront it.
You mentioned that, at times different people, different groups rise up, and things get, I don't remember quite how you put it, but you said that groups rise up and there's no one that controls it, and it gets out of hand. How do you prevent things from getting out of hand?
Right. I mean, the thing that we're, of course, the most concerned about after Syria, or after any kind of civil conflict, particularly one that's been fought on sectarian or ethnic, or sometimes even political grounds, is that people will tend to view the other as the enemy, as all guilty, and they will seek private vengeance, maybe from the individual perpetrator, maybe from his family, maybe from his group. And if you continue that kind of thing, sort of an eye for an eye kind of approach, then you're saying everybody's blind. You can't. The point of a judicial system, like maybe kind of utilitarian, is of course to put a stop on vigilantes, and to the extent that you have a justice process where people are able to participate and see something done, that will reduce the impetus for private vengeance. And just can imagine living in a society where maybe one of our own children is killed and there's no police. You'd want to go get the killer. But if there's police ready and there's a trial, you don't do that. And so that's what you want to avoid. And to the extent, I mean, we can see in Syria, but this isn't certainly a full explanation of it, that the killings that occurred on the coast, maybe 1,500 people, were to some extent out of control elements. That's of course what the government says, the current government, the interim government. But then there are also sort of you had an area in which every Sunni Muslim in like Banias was murdered, and so they're settling the scores. So people from around that area are settling the scores against the Alawite communities from which the killers came. And if there had been a process of justice initiated in which the organizers of those killings were being prosecuted, you might not have had the same measure of anger and hostility and desire for vengeance. So it is important to begin those processes in order to stay the hand of vengeance, and at least Shara and Syria said we can't have manifestations of private vengeance. And they issued a report in the last day about not completely clear on who's responsible, or talking about a special court to prosecute those who committed crimes against Alawites. But I'm sure the victims of the massive crimes committed by the Assad government by Alawites and by their allies, and not all Alawites committed the crimes, but obviously Assad was an Alawite. The victims can say, "Where's justice for us? You're already going after this people that were angry because justice hadn't happened." So they need to deal with both, and they need to be seen to be making some progress on it. As difficult as it is in a country that's got a reconstruction that needed maybe $900 billion to reconstruct from the war, and is under sanctions, and when you go to Syria, people you buy gasoline out of milk bottles, but it's getting many milk bottles as you need to get across town. It's just being sold on the other side of the street, adulterated fuels, even. It's that. So real problems with just almost anything that's happening, and you got to come up with a justice system, police, and proof, and judges, and all of that. Can we wait a little while for that? Nope, we can't wait. We'll continue to have this private vengeance.
In terms of prevention, I mean, the International Criminal Court, for example, do you think there's enough of a sense of deterrence that if I do these terrible things, that one day they're going to come and get me, that I will have to be, hauled away to The Hague and put on trial? Or do you think that this comes up in the thinking of people who are engaged at the higher levels of atrocity?
Well, not as much as it should, but in part because the court's relatively ineffective. It's got a lot of fugitive people that it's charged that haven't answered the warrant, so to speak, and there are certain situations like Russia, which governments of which leaders of which have never been held to account for anything. The crimes of Stalin, because of the crimes of the KGB, which Putin comes out of. No accountability for that, where there were accountability for the crimes of the Nazis, for instance. And so that, leads to an expectation of impunity and to getting away with it. Russian soldier was just convicted in a Finnish court, Finland court, for crimes committed. He happened to be in Finland, so they actually had him collared and prosecuted and got a life sentence, etc. So occasionally some people get held to account. But if the risk is so low that you're going to get prosecuted, then it may be relatively meaningless. It does have a greater impact, and we're cases in Kenya, which weren't effective in prosecutions, against the post-election, those allegedly responsible for the post-election violence in 2007, 2008, in which about 1,200 people were killed, 600,000 displaced. Cases in the ICC failed. They allowed the defendants to appear without being jailed. But the next elections, there haven't been any violence. It's who wants to go spend all that money on an attorney to fight this thing? It's so there are impacts. You see it in some other countries where leaders, rather than they've got riots in the street, they're seeking an umpteenth term, and they finally decide, well, I could shoot people down in the street and end up in The Hague, or I could take my money and leave. And they take their money and leave. And there is some impact, but obviously it depends to a large extent on the power of the regime. And then, of course, it depends on the effectiveness of the international court. And it's nothing like we have in the domestic system, where mostly domestic systems in developed countries, where there's a sense that there's a fairly decent chance that the police will catch you and you'll be prosecuted and convicted. The chance of it happening at the international level is fractional comparatively, because normally there's not even a court with jurisdiction. If you're, not in the ICC, China and Russia will protect you with veto. Anything that the UN might do to send it to the ICC or create a court, you've kind of got to get out of the jail-free card. And so it's the possibility that you might get arrested in some other country that might proceed with a case under universal jurisdiction. If you're willing not to travel, and you don't have to worry. So, it's it is spotty, but the risk is created, and that can affect people at the front end. However, once they've gotten into the business of committing all sorts of horrible crimes, the natural result at that point is to try to kill their way out of it, and not to surrender to justice because they're guilty already. So it's got to be at the kind of front end. You've got that kind of impact. But it's not just the deterrence that you get. I mean, you get norms kind of established. I mean, in Sierra Leone, we had a court that could only prosecute those most responsible. We indicted 13, we arrested 10, including President next door, President Taylor, and convicted all of them. And the court went out of business. And in following elections in that country, in which there was a couple of elections that were very close, in which the opposition won up to file no lethal violence. People violence about special court if you're violent. Special court was out of business. I mean, it was sort of like, this court, you try to gain or hold power by violence, you're going to get in trouble. And so, it becomes something you just don't do. And as a result, in that situation, the Sierra Leone court actually we prosecuted both sides. We prosecuted the nasty rebels, and we supported Taylor, and we prosecuted the leaders of the militia that fought on our government's side, restore democracy, that committed atrocities. And so it wasn't even, you're fighting on the right side, you're going to get out of jail free card. No, you fight on the right side, that you go out and kill innocent civilians intentionally. The pale among spikes, or whatever the kind of things they were doing, you're going to get prosecuted too. And that kind of approach, to the extent you can manage it, I think does have a real effect on the country, even one that's very poor, which the regular justice system is not very effective because they can't afford it.
I'd like to change direction a bit here now. In another direction I did for the series, I spoke with William Chavis, who, of course, you're familiar with his work, and he talked about a desire for a formal recognition of a right to peace. I'm unsure what a right to peace would mean, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on the concept of formalizing a right to peace.
Well, I mean, it is. I mean, the most the most legal aspect of it is when it comes to the crime of aggression, is the right to live without, free of unprovoked attacks from another state, et cetera. And that when you're victimized in such a case, even if you're victimized as a soldier who's conscripted to go to the front and you're shot at the front, that's not a war crime. You can shoot the soldiers on the other side. More, there are such things as privileged combatants, as long as you're shooting a military target. Generally, it's not a war crime. Indiscriminate, right? Things like that. It's a hard thing to deal with, but there's no crime. But if, like as in the case of Russia and its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine and hundreds of thousands of young men are pulled away from school and work and go to the front, and 100,000 get killed. Children is single parent, and all of the horrible loss. Your rights have been violated, and my friend. Um, I'm a nice dad of the docket, it's established by the Clooney Foundation. They've gone to the Human Rights Committee in Geneva, that not the Human Rights Council, but the Human Rights Committee that deals with rights created under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, specifically the civil and political rights, and sought a ruling that people who are essentially their rights to life, their right to physical integrity, their right to personal dignity, those rights are taken from them because of an aggressive war. They've had their rights, their human rights violated. So there is that right to peace. Now, on the other hand, if you're a Russian soldier, or Korean soldier that's conscripted to go fight in Putin's war, then you're not a victim of a crime of aggression, and then then you get to the question of is it a war crime? Kill you after you surrender, for instance, that kind of thing. So it does create, like any crime of aggression, this sort of issue of who started it, which sometimes can be controversial, because sometimes the party who started it has there's been sufficient provocation such that they're justified. So it gets mixed up in that aggression kind of issue, but that's the one way in which international law can recognize this sort of right to peace.
Are there any other aspects of this that you want to talk about or have on the front of your mind?
I mean, fundamentally, the approach that I think a society has to take, even in a peace negotiation, is to recognize the goals of transitional justice, and there are, of course, tradition of transitional justice, 4 pillars: truth, prosecutions, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. And transitional justice needs to include all components. But for my money, if you're involved in that process and you say, well, we can't get to 2, 3, and 4 right now, we'll have to think about that. It's too difficult. But then it leads to, there has to be a truth process. There has to be a process established, which does bring forward the truth of what occurred in the conflict. It does. In the Syrian context, for instance, 130,000 people are missing, and their families are entitled to information about, what happened to them. That could be, from the records of the detention facilities in which they were tortured. It could be from a much longer process of digging the mass graves and, matching DNA from the relatives. But they're entitled to that. And frankly, from my mind, that almost always leads to the demand, as we have in, say, the Truth Commission in Gambia, to prosecute those who are seriously responsible, but to develop a more limited prosecution approach, which goes after the sort of authors of the crime that seeks not to essentially criminalize everybody who is on one side or another. So that's, and then of course you deal with the fact that the victims are fundamentally interested in survivors and reparations, loss of the breadwinner, and, how they're going to support themselves, the destruction of the property, etc. And of course, it's rare that people can get reparations, but there has to be some program there, maybe modest school fees and medical treatment, a variety of things like that should be provided. But fundamentally, it's all they're trying to develop approaches that will ensure that it doesn't happen again. My concern with things like amnesties is that it will tend to invite it to happen again, because parties will say, well, I don't like the deal, I'm not the big shot that I was, I'm going to line up a bunch of militia people and call ourselves the coalition for the defense of democracy or something, and we'll go out and start killing the other side. And maybe I'll get power, but if I don't get power, I lose again, I get an amnesty. So you have to, there has to be a sense that at least the people who really are the authors of these crimes need to face the consequences, or it will happen again, and there won't be peace. It'll be phony, it'll be a false peace, and it's not what people want, not what they deserve.
When I've spoken with people who have become intimately engaged in dynamics of mass atrocity and genocide, like you, and actually one of my early interviews was several years ago with Ben Ferencz, who as a young man was a big part of the Nuremberg trials following the Second World War and the establishment of the International Criminal Court. And I'm always kind of pleasantly astonished at how congenial and relaxed people who have been engaged in issues of such atrocities, how they are. When Mr. Ferencz spoke to me, he said he was on the deck of his home in Florida where he had retired, and we had a very comfortable, informal discussion. And I don't see, or very rarely see, anger and stress or anxiety, post-traumatic symptoms in our conversations with people for the podcast. People won't see it, but we're on Zoom, and you smile quite readily. So I'm always astonished at this, that people like you can continue this good work that you do with an amicable outlook still on the world.
Yes, that's not to say that as one engages in it, as Ben was adding up the million people in the voting machine at the foreign ministry at Wilhelmstrasse, and adding up the numbers that have been filled by the assets group, and got to 1 million. Went to his boss and said, we need to prosecute these guys. When they're saying we killed so many women, so many men, so many children on this day in this trench, etc., that he wasn't powerfully affected by that. As we all are, we face this, but the aspect of it that makes it livable for me is you're finding a route for justice, for the truth to be told, for it not to be recur. You're engaged with the victims and survivors and explain what you're doing, and they have so little hope when they hear that you can do this and this and this, and they believe you, and then you follow through. It's enormously satisfying, to be frank. And so I do find that, I'm energized by engagement with people that have been through these experiences, and by then finding a way forward for justice. And so it is, obviously, one never succeeded. Every wall you went into, you then hit against, and you didn't succeed. then I can see being intensely depressed. And certainly there have been times when I think I had commitments and then they're broken, that I can be very angry. But fundamentally, it's a way forward and offers some promise. And like all of us, even people whose children in violence will say, well, I want my child to be remembered, and he's remembered if something is created that means some other child, this won't happen to them, and say, okay, I can do that. So that's, and that would make me as a parent feel good. So anyway, as I said, you're doing something that you honestly feel and have some evidence for that feeling can do some good. To take that suffering and by a process of justice, relieve some of it and prevent similar things from happening. I think is something that is quite satisfying. It makes you possibly to smile, even after all of these horrors that you've seen presented at it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.